She did not die in chaos. She did not die running. On May 9th of 1976, Ulrike Meinhof died in a prison cell, and the stillness of that moment has never quite matched the noise that followed. Picture the scene carefully. It's a narrow cell in Stuttgart-Stammheim prison. Concrete walls, a small bed, a chair, a light that never fully lets the room rest in darkness. There's guards nearby, doors locked. A routine is in place, and inside that space, there's a woman whose life had already pushed far past the boundaries most people would ever approach. By the time of her death, she was not simply a prisoner. She was a symbol. She was a subject of fear, of fascination, of anger, and of obsession. But symbols are not supposed to end quietly. But that's exactly how it happened. Ulrike Meinhof had not begun as a figure people whispered about in fear. She began as a child, shaped by loss. Her father died when she was young, and her mother followed not long after. By her teenage years, the ground beneath her life had already shifted one too many times. People who studied her late in life often turn this into a point because instability early on has a way of echoing forward. It doesn't always create something extreme, but sometimes it does. In her case, it seems to sharpen everything. Her thinking, her emotions, her reactions. There was a restless intensity in her that did not fade as she grew older, but instead it deepened. As a student, she moved toward ideas that promised clarity and change. She studied philosophy, sociology, and education, diving into questions about power, society, and even responsibility. But what stands out is not just that she believed strongly, is that she did not seem to sit comfortably with uncertainty. Where others debated, she pushed. Where others hesitated, she leaned forward. She wrote, she spoke, she challenged. And slowly the line between observing the world and trying to force it into a shape that she wanted began to blur. That shift does not happen overnight. It builds thought by thought and choice by choice. By the 1960s, she had become a recognizable voice. She was a journalist and an editor. She was someone who could influence how others saw events unfolding around them, as journalism does. But there was something unsettled beneath that. Even as she worked within the systems, she criticized them. Even as she gained a platform, she distrusted it. That kind of internal contradiction can wear a person down. It can also push them toward more extreme answers, and in her case, it did both. The words that she began to write changed in tone. They were sharper and harder. They were less patient. Then came the turning point that would define everything that followed. She crossed from commentary into action. That decision is often described in simple terms, but this was not simple. It was a collapse of boundaries. Once she stepped into that world, there was no gradual adjustment. It was immediate, intense, and irreversible. She became involved in acts that moved far beyond protest into violence and planning and secrecy. The woman who once analyzed events was now helping to shape them in a very different way. And yet, even within that shift, there were signs of something unstable. She was not always aligned with those around her. She argued and she questioned, but she also contradicted. Some described her as brilliant. Others described her as erratic. Both can exist at the same time, and in fact, they often do. There are accounts of her pushing herself beyond her physical limits and of ignoring her injuries, of her acting with a kind of urgency that did not always match the situation. That urgency can look like conviction, but it can also look like imbalance. The line between the two is not always clear, especially from the outside. Eventually, the life she had stepped into caught up with her. Arrest followed, and with it came something that would shape the final years of her life more than anything else: isolation. Solitary confinement is often described in neutral terms. A person is alone in a cell with limited contact. It's a controlled environment. But those descriptions miss what it does internally. Over time, isolation does not just remove interaction, it begins to distort a person's perception. Thoughts begin to loop, emotions amplify, time stretches and compresses in unpredictable ways. For someone already carrying intensity and instability, that environment can become something else entirely, something far more dangerous. During her confinement, she wrote about what she was experiencing. The descriptions are difficult to read. She spoke of her head feeling as though it might explode, of her thoughts slipping away from her, of a sense that she was being controlled from the outside. Those are not casual complaints. They're signs of severe psychological strain. Whether that strain was caused entirely by the isolation or whether it was magnified by something already present is still debated. But whether it is clear that there was a mental state that was under extreme pressure. Whether this was caused by the isolation or whether there were early signs of this is still debated. But yet this is where the story becomes complicated. In the days leading up to this young woman's death, people who interacted with her did not describe her as somebody who was really completely broken. They described her as someone engaged, someone discussing legal strategies. She was still thinking ahead, and that contradiction is important. It does not eliminate the possibility of taking her own life. People can appear composed right up until the moment that they do. But it also prevents the story from settling into something simple. It introduces doubt. On the morning of May 9th of 1976, she was found in her cell, hanging from a rope made from a towel. The official conclusion came quickly. Of course, this was a symptom of she took her own life. The announcement moved fast, almost as if it had been prepared in advance. Within hours, the narrative was in place, but for many, this felt too fast, too clean, and too certain. Questions began pretty much immediately. There was no note left behind. There were physical details that did not fully align with the expectations of someone ending their own life. Reports of marks and injuries raised concerns. Items in her cell did not quite match the sequence of events that were being described. Even the position of the chair beneath her became a point of discussion. These may sound like really small details, but in a locked room, small details mean everything. Supporters and family members pushed back against the final version. They pointed to these inconsistencies, to missed information, to the speed of the investigation. Others argued that the explanation did not need to be complicated. Isolation, pressure, and psychological strain were enough. And it is. Often. That there were no external actions required to explain the outcome, they argued. And so the divide formed. And that divide has never been fully closed. Then years later, something surfaced that added an entirely new layer to her story. Her brain had been removed during the autopsy and kept, not briefly and not for a short period of study, but for decades, without consent from herself, of course, or from her family, without public knowledge. It's not uncommon to do an autopsy and keep pieces from prisoners, but to do it without public knowledge was quite a bit more unusual. But this fact was only discovered much later and then buried. Her brain was buried in 2002. And that detail changes how people see the entire situation surrounding her death, because it suggests that even after her death, she was not simply laid to rest. She was examined. She was analyzed. She was reduced to something to be studied. It raises questions about how she was viewed, not just as a person, but as a subject, as something to be understood or perhaps explained away. So where does that leave her story? There are two dominant possibilities, of course. One is that a woman under extreme psychological pressure, already carrying the signs of instability, reached a breaking point in isolation and ended her own life. The other is that the circumstances around her death were not as straightforward as they were presented, and that something more occurred within the locked cell. But both possibilities exist within the same set of facts. Both are supported and challenged by different pieces of evidence, and neither has been able to fully erase the other. So, what remains is the image of a small room, a single body, a conclusion that arrived too quickly for some and too slowly for others, and a life that, even in its final moments, refused to settle into a single explanation. Because in the end, Ulrike Meinhof did not just leave behind a death, she left behind a question. And questions, unlike people, do not stay confined. So here's what I want you to think about. When a history and a story presents two possible truths, one rooted in human fragility and the other in something far more unsettling, which one do we choose to believe and why? In recent years, there's been a similar case that's come up here in the United States, and it's been a major topic of debate here as well, for good reason. I know how most of the people in society think about that particular case. I'm not going to say the name because that name grosses me out. But I think you know exactly who I'm talking about. But when it comes to stories like Ulrike Meinhof, how do we think? How do we feel? And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps.